Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Lucy Winskell. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor here at Northumbria University with the responsibility around employability and partnerships, but much more important, I'm also a trustee of the Community Foundation. So you are all very, very welcome to the Great Hall here at Northumbria University tonight. It's very fitting, I think, that we are hosting this particular debate, the role of donors, philanthropy, in this particular building as part of our contribution at Northumbria to the GeNErosity Festival. And I'm just going to explain why the significance of the Great Hall, I think, is so important for this. I know some of you know this building well, but others, it is the first time you've been here. So a bit of history. This Great Hall was built in 1887 for the pricely sum of £31,000. It was the site of a former cricket ground. And it was originally built as Durham University Medical School, and they occupied it right until 1938. And if you come in this side of the building, you'll see DCUM, Durham University Medical College and Medicine, on the wall. During World War II, it was a naval warehouse. And then in 1948, it opened as the Sutherland Dental School, which then, some of you will remember, became part of Newcastle University, and it was named after Sir Arthur Munro Sutherland, a former RGS pupil here in Newcastle, who was Lord Mayor of Newcastle. Fast forward to 1978, and it was transferred to Newcastle Polytechnic, and we know the history of Newcastle Polytechnic. That became Northumbria University. And this has been used as the law school, the law library. We've had exams in here, but mostly we use it for events like this. It is available for parties. I indeed hosted my own 50th birthday party here a little while ago in this room with that Christmas tree. We rolled the floor back and had a dance. But the reason I'm just labouring the point is I want you to look up and see this beautiful plasterwork and to have a look at the names. So I mentioned a few minutes ago Sutherland. So that name will be up there, as are the names of the other benefactors, 21 original benefactors to start with that provided the funding for the medical school. So you'll see some good old Northumberland names up there like Armstrong, Sutherland, Gibson, and so on. The sharp-eyed among you will see there are a couple of plaques at the end where there is still room for somebody, for a cool million, to have their name, you know, I'll take an offer, to have their name put up there. Well, there is a Williamson, I think, up there, Rob, so I'll have to pick on someone, the Hodgson, perhaps, something like that. But I draw it to your attention because this university, or rather the founding colleges, came about because of Northeast donors, benefactors and philanthropy. And no doubt in the course of this evening we'll be asked to vote whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and whether perhaps there were conditions that attached to their gifts. That's all I want to say except welcome. I'm really looking forward to this debate. I know you are as well. And Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And thank you to Northumbria University for your support in hosting us this evening and getting this room and all the refreshments that we've had. Thank you very much. So the Community Foundation matches generous people with important causes in the community, and every year we award hundreds of grants to groups through funds set up by our donors. And the event this evening is part of the GeNErosity Festival, which the Community Foundation is running with Newcastle University and many other partners, County Durham Community Foundation, Muckle, and many supporters and sponsors. The festival is the first of its kind in the UK, and we think the world. And with academics in the room, they're not mic'd up yet, so they can't challenge me. We think it's the first festival of its kind in the world. And it's been running for 3 weeks with 50 events taking place from Berwick right down to Teesside. And the festival comes to an end formally tomorrow on International Giving Tuesday. And tonight is really our final headline event. We've aimed to do 3 things with the festival. First, we've sought to celebrate and raise awareness of what philanthropy has achieved in the North East, drawing on unique new research from Newcastle University on 900 years of the region's philanthropic history, looking at who those donors have been, the organisations that have benefited, and the difference their giving continues to make in shaping life and lives in this region. And what Lucy's just been telling us about is very much part of that story. Second, with the festival, we've been seeking to encourage philanthropy and giving in all its forms by demonstrating what a joyful act giving can be and the good it can do. And we've been profiling lots of the organisations that benefit from philanthropy and giving in the region, and there are more on our website. But third, the festival has very much been about discussing the role of philanthropy now and its role in the future, especially in a time of political uncertainty, continuing austerity, and technological disruption. And it was always our plan to bring the festival to a close with a great debate, because we know philanthropy can be contentious, and we think it's important that the challenges around the topic of philanthropy are aired. And actually, across the festival already, people have been engaging in passionate discussions about a whole range of issues related to charity, to giving, and to philanthropy. So to bring those challenges to the fore, we have contributions from 4 brilliant panellists this evening, to whom I will introduce you in a moment. But first, let me say something about the debate format. So the motion we're going to be debating this evening is this: philanthropy does more for donors than it does for society. 2 of our speakers are going to make arguments in favour of the motion. 2 will speak against it. We're going to go in the order of 4 against, 4 against. Each speaker has a maximum of 8 minutes to make their case to you. Once they have all spoken, I will invite each of them in turn to present a challenge to one of the debaters on the opposing side. And they'll have a minute to do that, and the opposers will have 2 minutes to respond. I'll then open it up to all of you for your contributions and your questions and challenges to the debaters. At the end, I'm going to ask you to vote on the motion. So there will be, by a show of hands, I will ask for all of those in favour of the motion, those against, and those of you, even after an hour of heated debate in this room, still don't know. Throughout the evening, we'd love you to engage via social media as well as here tonight. You can tweet using the @GeNErosityFest handle and the hashtag #PoweredByPhilanthropy. So now can I please invite our speakers to join me on the stage. So our first speaker, arguing in favour of the motion, is Roger Burrows. Roger is Professor of Cities at Newcastle University, where he is also associated with the Centre for Research on Entrepreneurialism, Wealth and Philanthropy. Dr. Beth worked as a fundraiser and charity manager before she co-founded the Centre for Philanthropy at the University of Kent. There she now leads research and teaching courses on philanthropy and fundraising, one of which there's information about on your seats. And Beth will be speaking against the motion. Diana Leat will be the second speaker in favour of the motion. Diana has held posts in universities and think tanks in the UK, the US, and Australia, and is the author of over 120 articles and books, particularly looking at the role of philanthropic foundations. And finally, speaking against the motion, Dr. Karl Wilding. Karl is Director of Public Policy and Volunteering at NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, and there he speaks and writes widely on issues facing the voluntary sector. So, as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you each to come up in turn to the lectern to give your contribution. You will have 8 minutes. You will be reminded at 2 minutes that you've got 2 minutes left, and then again at 30 seconds, and after that we will cut you off, and that will be the end. And then you will return to your seat, and the next speaker will come up. So, without further ado, Roger, can I invite you to get the debate started? Thank you very much.
Here's a picture of something that looks like an elephant. It's in fact a graph which shows how income has changed globally since 1980. And it shows something very interesting, I think. It shows that those at the bottom of the income distribution have done reasonably well. It shows that those in the center of the income distribution have fared not very well at all, actually. But it shows something very, very significant. It shows that those people, not just in the top 1%, but in the top 0.1%, have fared very, very well indeed. They've fared very well indeed, especially since 2008, when you might remember we were all in it together during the global financial crash. The top 0.01% have pulled away in a way that is quite dramatic and which I think must frame the debate today. The distribution of income and wealth globally is not as it was. We've always had wealthy people. We've often had very wealthy people. We now have people with so much wealth that it's unbelievable. I want to show you a little chart that Oxfam produce each year. This, again, is a statistical calculation, but just bear with me. This is a calculation which takes the richest people in the world and adds them up, and it adds them up until the figure has reached the same amount as the wealth that is possessed by the bottom 50% of everyone on the planet. Everyone on the planet. And you'll see that in 2010, you could take 388 billionaires and add their wealth together, and they would have had as much wealth as the bottom 50% of everyone on the planet. And you'll see the direction of travel. In 2011, it had gone down to 177. By 2014, 80. By 2015, a busload of billionaires possessed as much wealth as the bottom 50% of people on the planet. 2016, the last year for which we have figures, it was 42. 42 individuals possessing as much wealth as the bottom 50% of people on the planet. That seems to me to be significant. And it seems to me to be significant because of the work of this man here, Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book in 2014 that some of you might have bought. I don't know how many people actually read it. It was a very, very long book. You used to see trendy people carrying it around. But what that book shows, I think, quite dramatically, is that the nature of the contemporary economy is such that rates of return on capital are much greater than rates of return on economic growth or wages and salaries. Indeed, the figures are very similar to those that pertained before the First World War. But since about 1979, when someone called Margaret Thatcher came to power in this country and Ronald Reagan came to power in the States, things have changed. And we've reverted to a situation that pertained before the First World War, where rates of return on capital have been much greater than rates of return on economic growth or wages. The inevitable consequence of that has been that wealth has become more and more and more concentrated. That is significant because we now have, as we've seen, a very, very small number of people who possess huge amounts of wealth. And unless we can find some mechanism for the transference of that wealth, for the redistribution of that wealth, we are going to be in trouble. We're already in trouble, some of us might think. The mechanisms by which that might occur are complex. Surely philanthropic giving is going to play a role, but there's going to have to be a lot of philanthropic giving for those people to actually transfer those significant sums of money to people further down the income distribution. And at a time when you walk around cities and see homeless people, when we're confronted with austerity, and we're confronted with hospitals in crisis, when we're confronted with the infrastructure of our towns and cities crumbling, how can people not see this? And how can people not make a case for dramatic changes in the taxation system to transfer some of this wealth back to the state and back to investments in our towns and cities? My argument isn't against philanthropic giving per se. It is to say, however, that philanthropic giving is sometimes used as a mechanism for not actually dealing with very, very difficult issues about the redistribution of wealth. And my final point is that we also should not necessarily assume that the very, very wealthy, who at one point had a civic obligation and would invest in a philanthropic giving that was designed to embrace democratic civic societies, we shouldn't assume that everybody's engaged in such philosophical positions. There are, I would say now, some billionaires, some very, very influential billionaires who hold political positions and sensibilities and engage in investment strategies that we might not like, who bypass the democratic impulse. This gentleman here, Peter Thiel, is a gentleman who made his money from PayPal. Some of you might have used PayPal. And he was one of the first external investors in something called Facebook, something that didn't catch on very, very, very much. Multi-billionaire, also a libertarian who in 2009 espoused a position where he thought that democracy and freedom were no longer compatible, who has used his giving to invest in a foundation which will pay people not to go to university, but to set up businesses, that will pay into organizations like the Seasteading Institute that some of you might be familiar with, libertarian cities to be built off our coasts, not subject to regulation by science, health services, states, who will invest in new technologies associated with blockchain, for instance, and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which are interesting, but are designed to bypass democratic institutions. I won't even talk about Elon Musk. People with huge amounts of money, and the ability to use it philanthropically, but who might indeed possess ideological and political positions that are to the detriment to the great majority of the population. So I'm not making a case against philanthropic giving per se. I am saying, let's think about the context. Let's be aware of what's happened in terms of global income and wealth distribution, something we don't routinely see on the front of the newspapers, but which is tragic and actually structures all that we actually are dealing with at this particular moment in time. And let's think about proper taxation policies and proper redistributive policies so that we can get on with a world that is for all of us. Thank you.
So I told you we'd get to some of the nutty and thorny issues this evening, and I think that's got us off to a great start. So, Beth, take up the reins for the opposing side, please.
Well, thank you very much. Roger said a lot of things that I've got no problem agreeing with. He talked about the growth and growing inequalities in wealth and how little of it is used to help others. Well, those are fair points, but you're talking there in general about the need for a fairer society and not really proving beyond reasonable doubt that philanthropy does more for donors than it does for society. And I want to answer that criticism firmly and rebut it. I've heard it many times before because it sums up a lot of the discomfort that people feel about big philanthropy. One of the main studies that I do is called the £1 Million Donor Report, and I've spent about 10 years interviewing people who've given away at least £1 million. If I had just £1 for every time someone said to me, oh, they're just in it for themselves, aren't they? Then I could be a £1 million donor as well. So let me begin by making one concession. Of course, donors get something out of it. Every academic study of philanthropic motivation concludes that there's a mix of personal and public benefits, and the nature of that mix varies because philanthropy might be universal, but it's never uniform. So the kind of personal benefits that donors get, feeling good about themselves, an improved sense of well-being, an enriched sense of purpose in life, and I'm sure those benefits are familiar to any donors who are here in the room. It is nice to be nice, as my grandma would sum up my career. You might not know that the personal benefits also include longevity. Studies show that donors have got lower stress levels and better physical health. So if you can tell that if you're on the other side of the equation and you're an asker, a fundraiser, you can tell that to your reluctant donors. The more you give, the more you live. Of course, there are external benefits as well. Donors might get a better reputation. That could be wide public recognition, or just family and descendants who are that little bit prouder of their relative. So yes, of course, the giver always gets something back, but the question that we're considering here tonight is the extent of that something. And I'm here to argue that the helper's high, or the giver's glow, or whatever you want to call it, is a fair swap for the extent of the positive contributions to society that philanthropy makes when it's done well. So let me give you some examples. The campaigns to abolish slavery, to secure the votes for women and working class, and to legalise same-sex marriage were all underpinned by philanthropic support. Someone has to fund the revolution. Now, sure, those donors probably felt good when their battles were won, and maybe they got to attend fancy events and hobnob with whoever the big names were of the day. But how can that be equated with the harms that were avoided and the benefits that were secured for their fellow men and women? Today, the lifeboats and the air ambulance and the hospices all rely on private donors and volunteers. Let's never underestimate the gifts of time and expertise as well as money. The same goes for most sports clubs, brass bands, village halls, PTAs, scout groups, brownie packs, theatres, galleries, animal shelters, religious organisations, local heritage, environmental sites. I could go on, but we have only got 8 minutes. These are the things that we and our loved ones rely on and make use of day in and day out. So my argument in a nutshell is, don't let your reluctance to give philanthropists just a drop of credit result in switching that tap off and saying, no thank you, you're getting too much out of this. That seems to me the definition of a self-defeating exercise. But if it's so common, where has this fear of donor benefit come from? Well, we've heard a lot of words and big numbers from Roger, but I take the view that a picture tells 1,000 words. So let me show you a picture of 6 men. And the question is, who are they? Don't worry, it's not audience participation. I'm going to tell you who they are. These are the 6 people on the Forbes list of British billionaires whose names begin with the letter A. They're just the first 6 British billionaires that you come across if you're interested in the names and faces behind the figures that Roger shared. Have you seen these people being berated in the press, chastised for being egotistical, do-gooding interferers who cause more harm than good? You probably haven't, no, because none of them are publicly known as philanthropists. They might well give privately, but they're not the people that come to mind when we talk about donors getting more benefits than they deserve. Actually, we do know a little bit about them from their Forbes profiles. One of them collects vintage Ferraris. Apparently, he's the only person in the world to own 2 Ferrari 250 GTOs, and I have no idea what that is. You can tell from the way I'm reading it out. One of them owns 2 super yachts and a £20 million private jet, and another one owns a $15 million condo in Miami, Florida. But we don't tend to worry about these people. We save our ire for the philanthropists, who just happen to be pretty much the only very rich people that we've ever heard of. So let's give Richard Branson a good kicking instead, shall we? So when you move on the alphabet, when you get to the B's, you do find some donors. There are 53 British billionaires named on the Forbes list, and just 5 of them have signed the Giving Pledge, which means they've committed to give away at least half of their wealth. So that's just under 10% of the 53 billionaires who've made that pledge. Globally, Forbes lists 2,208 billionaires, and so far there are 186 signatories to the Giving Pledge. That's 8% of the list. So why are we talking about and worrying about that 8% rather than the other 92%? I think the simple answer is because their philanthropy brings them into the public eye. But is it really the ones spending money on those things on the left that we should be worrying about, rather than those spending money on those things on the right? Is this not just a case of massively misdirected angst? The most famous names on both the global billionaire list and the Giving Pledge list are Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Both give via the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose largest donations go to efforts to eradicate the diseases that kill children living in poor countries, like malaria and measles. They've joined forces with the World Health Organization to try and eradicate polio. And after $11 billion of funding, $3 billion of which comes from Gates, worldwide cases of polio have been cut by 99.9%. So in 1988, 1,000 children a day were paralyzed by polio, but 30 years later, after 2.5 billion children have had the vaccine, illustrated at the top, polio is now virtually eliminated. Now, whether or not you think Gates and Buffett feel good or sleep better or have got a better reputation or get to hang out with stars as a result, that's surely done more good for wider society than for themselves. I've interviewed a couple of the British Giving Pledge signatories. Sir Ian Wood's Family Trust has spent millions supporting smallholder farmers in Africa, pictured in the middle. And Sir Chris Hone, whose Children's Investment Fund Foundation is the first British philanthropy and focuses on climate change as well as other issues. So whose side are you on? Those who keep their head down and spend their money on those things on the left, or those who stick their head above the philanthropic parapet by funding global public health, supporting poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, and tackling climate change? And if you still say, well, they're all as bad as each other, then what are you going to do about it? Ban philanthropy? Have a state monopoly on solving social problems? Well, that didn't work out too well in places like the Soviet Union and communist-era China, but it would be good news for those who sell fast cars and private jets and exclusive real estate. Dissing donors does not make the world a better place. So my final words are another picture. The wonderful cartoonist Gary Larson has a nice cartoon that illustrates the problem of being careful what you wish for. He shows a man in a narrow crevice singing, "Oh, give me a home where the buffaloes roam, where they're on the way and about to trample him." Like him, we should all be careful what we wish for.
Thank you, Beth. Diana, take up the argument for the other side, please.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, but I do wonder what I volunteered for. I just want to be very clear at the beginning. The question isn't, do people benefit from philanthropy? We could ask that. And indeed, Beth has raised that by saying, well, the benefit to society is a fair swap for what philanthropists get out of it. Well, maybe, but the society with the highest level of philanthropy in the world is the US. I think it's taking a bit of a long time to produce these major benefits. Anyway, so the question isn't, do people benefit from philanthropy, but who is in control? Whose needs come first and guide what happens? And what I want to suggest is, this is not about blame or shame or anything. It's actually built into the system that donors come first. So, first point, donors decide what they'll give to. That's okay. Crucially, they decide what they will not give to. Of course, you may say, well, that's fair enough, it's their money. Well, indeed. But as Beth has already admitted, they are unsurprisingly guided by what interests them and not by most pressing social needs. And I thank you, Roger, for this point. I was interested, Beth, that your donors who keep their heads below the parapet were all white men. You might want to have another look at that. I'm going to focus mainly on philanthropic foundations as another vehicle through which the wealthy impose their own preferences and values on society. And of course, in addition to deciding what you give to and crucially what you don't give to, donors often attach conditions to the gift, but I haven't got time to go into that. Some donors, of course, but they are a minority, temper their own preferences by saying, my thoughts are this and that, but I appreciate that things change, and you, the trustees, may decide otherwise. Great. Interestingly, however, trustees are mostly selected by founders, and most likely, again, fairly obviously, people whom they trust in their own image or mold. And what I find really fascinating is that board members frequently tend to continue to do what the donor would have wanted, even after his or her death. And that's what I meant about saying it's not only about donors, it's about the whole culture of philanthropy and so on. Now, personally, I would be deeply, deeply offended if my trustees said, oh, well, Diana wanted that in 2018, so I guess in 2028 she'd still want that. Well, you should know me better. I change my mind quite often. So what I'm saying is it's not entirely the donor's fault that their wishes continue to come first, even when the donor, him or herself, might have admitted that his or her wishes were completely outdated and no longer related to the most pressing needs of society. And I could tell you some wonderful stories about donations. One of my favorites is a donation to buy mob caps for virgins in Cowbridge. Cowbridge is an area of Cardiff that is not, well, it might be wealthy now, but it wasn't. Now, there's another reason why donors' wishes come first, because that's the law. Charity law requires that money is distributed according to what the donor gave it for. And the only way you can get around that is with CPRE, which is a major hassle. And we see that the problem of that most clearly and increasingly clearly with social media giving following disasters. People don't understand that you have to give what you said it was for. And in disasters that can have some very perverse consequences. In addition to all that, of course, the law says that beneficiaries can't be represented on the board. Now, another couple of clues as to whose interests come first. Well, perpetuity is quite a big clue. Spending out a foundation is considered, it's sufficiently unusual to be considered noteworthy. But if it were really about benefit to society, wouldn't you be giving it all you've got immediately? What's the point in waiting for climate change? What's the point in waiting for disadvantaged children, to continue that cycle of disadvantage? Naming might be seen as another clue to who this is really about. Public relations, legacy, networking. Another clue would be, okay, so where do they, if this is about the good of society, where do they invest their money? And here, just have a look at where Bill Gates invests his money. Social good? I think not. And then listen to donors talking about their philanthropy. It's very often the conversation is about family dynamics, about the glue that holds our family together, about teaching children moral values, etc. My final point is the point that Roger has already raised, and that is philanthropy is, in my view, all too often seen as an alternative to paying taxes. I've just spent the weekend doing a review of a book, a biography of Karl Gulbenkian. He became so obsessed with avoiding tax that he really pretty much forgot why he was avoiding the tax. And in fact, so underspecified his foundation that it turned into something that was quite other. J.K. Rowling is my heroine on this one. She's very, very clear. You pay your tax first, and then you give on top of that, not instead of. And then my very final point would be, I have yet to see the evidence that philanthropy is actually, as it's currently practiced, socially redistributive overall. Thank you.
So, Karl, down to you.
I'm not sure Rob told me I was following Diana Leat after. What a fantastic hall we're in. And of the names that are on the walls of this fantastic hall, I do notice that one of the ones up here is called Humble, which I think many philanthropists are, actually. I think there's a danger that somehow we're sort of, in debating before you, that we are stretching this too far to its extremes, and actually we forget that altruism is one of the things that I think is just integral to us as human beings, and that's what drives a lot of philanthropy. But I actually want to start off perhaps slightly differently and say, I'm not sure I actually like philanthropy. I grew up in Blackburn, a mill town in sort of Lancashire, and I still remember when I was growing up that one of the two local hospitals was Blackburn Royal Infirmary. And for those of you that will know the name infirmary, you might know that the origins of the infirmary actually were in the poor law, the Victorian welfare state, for want of a better expression. And my recollection is that my grandparents, they didn't like going to the infirmary because they could still remember what that was all about. That wasn't about respectability, that great thing that my working class forefathers aspired to. And I think they felt pretty much the same about charity, because for my grandparents, their understanding of that word philanthropy meant something quite different to perhaps the way that we talk about it today. For them, it was about social control. It was something that you were embarrassed about if you received if you were on the end of, I should say. But then again, in Blackburn, we didn't have a Salt. We didn't have a Roundtree. We didn't have an Armstrong like this. And I mention those great philanthropists of our past because it seems to me unquestionable, actually, that the legacies that they've left us with are incomparable to any benefits that they may have received during their own lifetime. I just pick one in terms of Roundtree, Joseph Roundtree. Some of the things that Roger is arguing against at the beginning here, Roundtree is at the forefront of funding academics to do the research to address exactly what we've been talking about. Roundtree's legacy is long and it's important. Fast forward 150 years or so from the time of Salt and so on, and we're still talking about philanthropy. But about 10 years ago, we reinvented that word philanthropy for the modern age. For some of you who might have come across Matthew Bishop and Michael Green, they were behind this so-called move for philanthrocapitalism, where philanthropy was less about social control, and it was much more about modern business methods. It was scientific philanthropy, I think, is an expression that has been used in relation to sort of foundations. It was a world where we would absolutely focus our efforts to change the world on funding what works. And then as a result of that, you see some of the people that Beth is talking about adding their names to things like Warren Buffett's Giving Pledge, where they are talking about how they change the world. But that's not all worked especially well, actually. The Gates Foundation, for example, is on the end of actually, I think, some quite important and valid critiques about what they've achieved that are probably less about this issue about sort of democratic accountability, and actually are a bit more boring, but a bit more important, that actually they're not very good at listening, and because they don't listen to people on the ground, actually they're not actually achieving as much as they could do. One of Diana's points at the end was about tax. And indeed, this issue about whether it's the philanthropist that benefits or society that benefits, tax is quite frequently wheeled out as an argument to justify the fact that philanthropists benefit more. Well, with great respect to Diana, who I've learnt most of what I know from, you'd have to be absolutely mad to give to a charity in this country as a way of not paying tax. I mean, seriously, you would have to not understand the tax system, okay? But what the tax system is, of course, doing is that if you are a 40% taxpayer, for example, if you give a gift of £10 to charity, the charity gets £12.50 because they are claiming the basic rate of tax, and you as the taxpayer are also getting £2.50 because you claim the difference between the basic rate and 40%. So a £12.50 gift costs you £7.50. That's leverage. That's not tax avoidance. The other argument that I think Diana pointed to, which I think has some justification, is this idea that the rich pursue their own interests when they're giving. So hence you see museums and arts as quite typically the sort of causes that are funded by the rich. A technical way, I guess, of saying that is that there is a charge that philanthropy is essentially the personal hypothecation of your own taxes. And again, I think there is some justification for those arguments. But it's incumbent upon us then to actually try and make sure that we live in a world where money is given not to what most amuses the philanthropist, or indeed to the causes that ask for it most. but actually we give to where it is most needed. And that, for me, is one of the big failings of philanthropy. We're not giving to where it's most needed. The last argument that I want to make is that I think we've got to put philanthropy into perspective. We talked about philanthropy today as something that's not changing the world when it should have done. Well, philanthropy in this country is about £10 billion a year if you look at what individuals give to charity. That's in contrast to the state spending £750 billion a year. Can we please get a sense of proportion about what it can achieve? Secondly, we've been talking about philanthropy as something that's just about the rich. Well, the rich, according to Beth's work, gifts of over £1 million a year are £1.5 billion a year. But gifts by the great unwashed like me are more like £10 billion a year. The point is that most philanthropy isn't from the rich to the poor. It's amongst those who don't have much money in the first place. And we miss that sort of philanthropy at our peril. So yes, I think we all benefit from altruism and reciprocity in society. Just think about your average day. When you leave the house, your journey to work, what you do in the evening, it's actually difficult to not come across something that involves charities somehow, is my argument. Philanthropy, therefore, it's a British value. It's not just a practice. It's something that knits us together. It's something that makes us citizens. It's the price of living in a civilized society, and yes, actually, I would argue that philanthropy is a civilizing influence. Back to Blackburn at the beginning. Closest thing that we had to a philanthropist in Blackburn in my lifetime was Jack Walker, if anyone knows who I mean by that. Funded the football team for a few years. And in my lifetime, he paid for the best number 9 I've ever seen before the Geordies got him back again. So he's living proof that philanthropy benefits not just society, but the donor as well.
Okay, so for very interesting, challenging and important contributions to this debate. So before I ask you to make some contributions yourself, I'm going to give the panel an opportunity just to pick up anything with each other and make a challenge of anything that they've heard on the opposing side. So I'm obviously sitting in the middle to keep them apart, but I'm going to start by asking Diana or Roger, is there a challenge or a point or a question you would like to raise of the other side, and to keep your comment or challenge to a minute, please?
I want to ask Beth, if you don't shout about your philanthropy and you just do it quietly, the other word for quietly is non-transparently. So does that make it, if I do it without anybody knowing, okay, I don't get the kudos, but I also don't get the kickback, if there is any?
Well, that's a very good point, and you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, really, aren't you? I mean, you can, is someone giving privately or anonymously doing it sneakily, or are they doing it modestly? Are they failing to be a good role model? Because we all know that if somebody comes out and declares their support for something and helps say, hey, you can do this, are they also having a dereliction of duty? So really, all these are just many different ways of saying we don't like philanthropists. We're dressing up a prejudice with fancy arguments, and I think you've just helped me underline my point there. Thank you.
Now, over to Karl and Beth. Would you like to take up the challenge to Roger or Diana in any of the points that were made?
So, Roger, your elephant. Is that not the best evidence that we've had all evening of why actually what this society really needs is more philanthropy, not less philanthropy?
No. My point would be that I think we are in a new domain in terms of wealth and income distribution, and that maybe lots of the kind of ethical and political positions we're discussing here are slightly outdated to actually deal with the challenge that we now confront. I think this acceleration and concentration of global wealth is now actually unprecedented. I think it's very interesting the way in which so many of the examples that you gave were fantastic philanthropic contributions to places where people had a civic responsibility and a pride in wanting to invest in their localities. We now have billionaires who possess as much wealth as small countries, individuals who have as much wealth as the GDP of Belgium or Holland. And I think that changes the challenges that we actually confront. This acceleration of wealth and control and power on a global scale is now something that is new and that we don't really know how to challenge, not least because it's not just about any one state dealing with taxation. How do you deal with Amazon? How do you deal with Facebook? How do you deal with Google? These are virtual countries, and they are investing and making decisions on a global scale. And I think politically and ethically, we haven't got our head around what that means in terms of that kind of challenge, in terms of the day-to-day attributes. They're sucking money out of places that previously would have been located within those localities. What's the Google equivalent of buildings like this? What's the Amazon equivalent of actually building civic spaces? I don't know. So I suppose my response is that I think things have changed, and I think we really need to get our head around this acceleration of concentrations of wealth, which is unprecedented.
Okay. And you get to ask a question now.
Oh, I get to ask
a challenge of the
question.
opposing side.
Well, I suppose I'm interested in some leaflets that were around here before. I think it was an MA in philanthropic studies that it was nice that you distributed around the room. I'm interested, I suppose, in the kind of the industry of philanthropy, actually, in terms of people such as yourselves, in terms of your role in the perpetuation of a particular ideological or political position in terms of supporting this activity. Indeed, this whole fantastic event is actually about a celebration of this kind of activity. And I'd just like to know kind of why. What's your motivation in terms of actually wanting to engage in running an MA, studying, writing books, and actually thinking about the infrastructure of support for this kind of activity?
So my motivation partly is because I think life is better because people get involved, whether it's giving their time or giving their money. I think one of the problems of the argument that you've presented is that almost the conclusion of it is that if we just put more money into the hands of the state, actually public services will all be better. Well, from my experience, actually, the state is pretty bloody rubbish, actually, sometimes, at protecting people's rights and public services. And it's only because of voluntary action, actually, we can stand up for those who are furthest from power. So I want to change society just the same way that you do. And I think it's through empowering citizens and enabling them to come together that we'll do it.
Good.
Do you want to?
I would love to ask Diana a question back. Diana.
Well, you might want to respond to the MA.
Oh, it's a life of glamour and riches. What can I say? Teaching an MA in philanthropy.
Can I break the rules and I will come in to support you there, Beth? Not the life of glamour, etc. But just most good philanthropy courses have a critical edge to them, and they ask exactly those questions about, well, you know, where is the impact? What is the benefit? What's the real distribution of philanthropy? So, yeah.
I suppose it was a question rather like the charities industry, the philanthropic industry, almost, you know, it's clearly not a kind of a neutral set of activities. And I was interested in, you've responded about what your own motivations were for actually getting engaged in this kind of activity.
No, we do teach on the dark side of philanthropy and unintended consequences and all that, but in our 7-minute simplified debate, then not for tonight.
But you get a chance to ask a question now.
Thank you. Diana, my question is to, I think. Yes, because you asked Roger. So Diana, you describe donors and beneficiaries as if they're inevitably in opposition and it's a fight for whose interests win out. But don't you agree, from your experience, that most often donors fund something because they've also got a vested interest in it? So their loved one had that cancer, or they also enjoy going to that theatre, or they're personally distressed by seeing homelessness. So they've been personally touched by the causes that they want to help. So isn't it true that donors and recipients are often on the same side, joined in common cause and solidarity, rather than this rather antagonistic relationship that you've depicted?
Nice question. I don't think I intended to depict it as antagonistic. I was merely trying to make the point that the law puts donors first. That's what I said at the beginning of my speech, but it isn't about donors being the bad guys. One of the points I wanted to raise was that the law encourages the privileging, I hate that as a verb, but of donors. Yes, of course you're right that people often give, the things that interest them and touch them are things that, with which they have some sympathy and some experience. I don't have that, that's fine, but when you aren't asking people, when the law doesn't enable you, it doesn't encourage you to consult beneficiaries. And of course, what we're talking about are the people who do benefit. One of my major concerns is the way in which philanthropists actually deny benefits to people that they are not interested in.
Okay. So, nodding in the audience, okay. So, this is the hardest thing to chair in the world because I have got so much to say, and anybody who knows me will know that sitting on my hands is not coming naturally to me. Anyway, I'm going to invite comments, challenges, questions. I'm going to ask for 2 or 3 at a time, so the panel have got a chance to just get their heads around what they're being asked, and then I'll invite the panel to respond.
A question for the supporters, proposers of the motion, just relating to Bill Gates, who seems to be given a hard time here. What would be your preferred model for eradicating polio as opposed to what actually happened?
Okay, and next along.
Mine's more of a comment than a question, so I think you should give me a little bit longer. I would just like to say it's more of a plea to the audience, actually. I think it's quite a difficult motion to vote on because the speakers on our right have told us what good philanthropy does for people other than donors. And the speakers on the left are highlighting problems with philanthropy as a thing. So my sort of plea to the audience is to abstain, because if, like me, you agree that you don't deny the benefits of philanthropy for people other than donors, but philanthropy as a thing isn't a fantastic ideal or a thing we aim for, as opposed to a properly funded welfare state, proper taxation, etc. I think it's difficult to vote on. Thank you.
The key to the motion is the word more. Okay, so I'm going to ask Roger and Diana. There were specific comments there, I think, to you about, well, what would you want to happen if it's not the role of philanthropy to engage in some of these things?
Sorry, could I just answer on the Bill Gates
Yes.
question? Because the point there was not whether or not he has the best model for eradicating polio or whatever, but rather the point that Bill Gates's investments are of extremely questionable social benefit. In fact, there are a lot of people who would say that the good that he does is at the expense of the bad that he does in investing in the things that he does invest in. And pressure...
You mean the foundation's financial investments?
Yes, the foundation's financial investments. So if you are about world health, then investing in Coca-Cola might not be the best way of going about that.
Okay. And Sally Ann's point?
No doubt, but I think the focus here is on, for me anyway, is on contemporary developments and where we are now when we look at the income and wealth distribution globally and how we should respond to that, because I don't see those investments occurring now. I don't see the money going into the food banks, I don't see the money going into the hostels, I don't see the money going into the places where there are a real need. I do see the money going in directions which are often quite political. I mean, colleagues will know better than I, but actually some of the trauma that we're all suffering at the moment around the Brexit debate is not unrelated to certain kinds of charitable giving and support for particular political organisations. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's certainly not as simple as the polio example. And so, in a sense, you could make the same argument around investments into charities which were supportive of people. Often the kind of philanthropic activity is political. Whether you agree with those political interventions or not, I don't know. My point is I think we should be attuned to the kinds of philanthropic investments that certain very, very powerful people, often, I'll say it, often white men, are making. That is not an inconsequential issue. The sorts of investments that are being made, the kind of political endeavours that are being engaged in, I think, demand a kind of an inquiry.
I was just going to say, well, clearly there's a temporal dimension to what you're saying. So in the lifetime of those philanthropists, one might argue it did benefit them more. You talked about hospitals. If you look at the distribution of hospitals in London, they're all within a 2-mile radius of Harley Street. It's not an accident, because the people who paid for them, it was about their social position in society. That's why they didn't set them up in the East End of London. It's why the very early Victorian hospitals operated something called the ticket system, where your access to medical care was not based on your illness, but was based on how many tickets you could get from philanthropists. But of course, over the longer term, they've had a huge benefit. Can I just quickly answer Roger's point? All philanthropy, all charitable giving, all volunteering, it's our expression of the sort of society that we want to live in. Okay, and where I might challenge you gently is that you've presented a view of society that you want to live in. Is that any better or worse than the sort of society some people who we might not agree with want to live in? That is the nature of this. It's voluntary.
I mean, I think that's exactly the point. If we're talking about a contemporary Roundtree, if we're talking about a Titus Salt, of course, I happen to have a particular political sensibility about the kind of society that I live in. All I'm saying is I think we need to be aware of the sorts of investments that are being made that are now being informed by perhaps a rather different sensibility, a sensibility that is primarily out of Silicon Valley, that is primarily about a libertarian and primarily about an anti-democratic set of impulses that I think we need to make ourselves aware of. So I'm not denying it. It's just not a view of the sort of society that I want to live in, that I share.
Okay.
And I have no democratic control over that because the money is going from very, very wealthy people.
Okay, a last word on this side before I go back to the audience.
I may or may not like the individuals that Roger has just named, but if I sat down and wrote out a list of contemporary philanthropists, I could also include people like Chuck Feeney at Atlantic Philanthropies. I could include a lot of other people that might have a very different view of the world. Denise Coates, if we want a woman, for example, if you all know Bet365, just had the biggest pay salary, I think, in this sort of country this year, and so on. There are alternative viewpoints that are funding what sort of society we want to live in.
Okay, back to the audience. There were some questions down there. I'm going to come to the front. So, what gentleman here? First, the gentleman there.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Roger and Diana about the cooperative model. That's where 1% of what the members buy goes to charities, then it comes back and is democratically voted on where that charity money goes to.
I totally agree with you that the tax benefits aren't a form of tax avoidance. But my concern is that the beating heart of philanthropy is, in essence, voluntary. It's our personal choice. It's the society we wish to see. And tax benefits do divert a huge amount of funding away from the Treasury in a time of real need. But whereas we actually democratically vote for our governments, and therefore they can determine which things they're going to fund, we don't democratically vote for the direction that philanthropy will take. So I think that's my point.
And then we'll take Fiona behind.
Thanks. I have a love-hate relationship with philanthropy, and I think there's probably quite a lot of love in the room, so I'm going to concentrate on the other side. The thing that maybe I think about in the dark hours of the night about philanthropy is that it does benefit the donors more because by giving to some of the terrible social ills in the country, it's the dark hours. I think that's the ghosts of my ex-trustees. Okay, because much philanthropy gives to patch over the consequences of an unjust society, It perpetuates an unjust society and enables donors to get richer and richer because not enough philanthropy addresses structural disadvantage and changes society so that ultimately, it's my belief that if philanthropy was really good, it would do itself out of a job.
Okay, I'm going to come to this side first because justice, tax.
So as a society, we have democratically agreed that actually using the state's ability to forego income tax to encourage people to support the causes that they believe in is the right thing to do, and every government of every stripe has supported that. We have also decided democratically what is charitable. You can only get those tax breaks if you give to something that has public benefit, so I will politely disagree with you on that point there. Fiona, if I just may, this idea that charity should do itself out of business is the most overused, misunderstood, hackneyed phrase. Because it presumes that all philanthropy is about social welfare. Actually, Beth mentioned the brass bands. I could talk to you about parkrun, the things that make life worth living. That is what philanthropy is about for me as well.
I mean, just to back that up, there's a Michael Moody, who I wrote the Philanthropy Reader with, has a very simple way of describing why we have philanthropy. Because things will always go wrong, and because things could always be better. And I can't imagine an end point in a society where those two things wouldn't be true, where we wouldn't need philanthropy anymore. Different things will go wrong. Going back to Sally Ann's point, you know, we don't need to fund certain things because the shifting boundary between the state and the non-profit sector changes all the time, but new needs will arise, new problems will emerge, new disasters will happen, new expectations and hopes will arise, and that's where philanthropy comes in, where people can just quickly make a difference if they want to use their own private resources to achieve that public good.
And there was a question about the cooperative model. Do you want to pick that up?
Other than I went, yes. I've no objections to that form of redistribution at all. Fully supportive of it.
So I have a question for Dr. Beth. Particularly on one point that you mentioned, you spoke about the failure of state-led redistribution of wealth in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Union and China. However, there's the other side, that is the failure of capitalism in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So I'm interested in knowing more about your point about how I believe these philanthropists are just trying to make up, or as one of the other comments said, patch up over years of exploitation, which is not proportional to is not a proportional redistribution, or like giving back what years of exploitation of how capitalism has destroyed these countries.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, at the opening of this event at the Discovery Museum, we talked about philanthropy as being more than just giving money and actually giving time. And I think because we're in the Northeast and I run a charity in the Northeast, I think when you look at the time and the volunteering that happens in this region, you can't possibly argue that it does more for the donors than it does for society, because there are so many unsung heroes in the Northeast that do so much. And I just wanted to put that out there, to not just necessarily think about Bill Gates and the money people, but the value of volunteering and time.
I run the risk of possibly making some enemies here, but I'll do a little plug first. The Community Foundation in Tyne and Weir in Northumberland is, I think I'm right in saying, the biggest outside of America, despite the fact that we've got the lowest population, I think, of most of the European community foundations. The philanthropists in the Northeast must therefore make up a disproportionate number of nasty, socially divisive people, using your argument to its extremity. Do you believe that the Northeast does produce the most?
Brilliant. Sorry, I'm not allowed to clap. Impartial.
Yeah, you can.
Totally impartial chair here, sorry.
Can I just
yes,
respond in terms of patterns of inequality? Which is why I think things have changed. Do you know that the patterns of inequality amongst the top 1% are greater than the patterns of inequality amongst the 99%? So, to be honest, I think the issues that we confront in terms of the sorts of issues that you deal with in the Northeast, fantastic as they are, pale into insignificance in relation to the sorts of wealth and resources I'm talking about. That the issues that really agitate me at the moment is that we don't have a grip and an understanding of the sorts of concentrations of wealth that aren't occurring in Newcastle, aren't occurring in Middlesbrough, aren't occurring in Northumberland, are occurring a little bit in London, but which are on a global scale. And I think that's the issue that I really want to focus on. Of course, no one is wanting to criticize the kind of amazing kind of activities that happens within localities in terms of various forms of charitable giving, of people making investments in universities and hospitals. That's not what I'm arguing against. I mean, I know that this is the issue is how we deal and what role philanthropic giving could play in actually confronting this huge challenge that we now confront in terms of this massive concentration of wealth. I know I keep banging on about it, but I want to get it on the front page of the Daily Mail. I want to get it into the BBC. Post-2008, things changed. Money has become more and more concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. How can we redistribute it away from them into other causes? And what role can philanthropic giving play in that kind of redistribution?
Can I say how great these questions are? I'm not just trying to curry favour, although, you know, feel free to vote for our side on the basis of this. These are really great questions. And to go to the gentleman at the front, I mean, that's a very good point to pick up on the failure of state-led redistribution, also the failure of capitalism. This is why people need to try and tweak and adjust to make society better in the way they think a good society should be run. But we teach about Soviet Union philanthropy on our course. We did it just last week, actually. And have guest lectures from people who are very close to the area and understand it and have studied it more than I have. And I learned that as a result of the banning of people being able to organise outside of state institutions, there were certain things you were allowed to do, and one of them was run sports clubs. So there's this proliferation of sports clubs, which really were just a front for doing good. So you pretended it was about hockey or gymnastics or what have you, but actually it was a way for people to help each other and support each other and redistribute philanthropically and voluntarily between each other. So I think the moral of that story is you can't stop people doing good, whether it's giving each other money or giving each other time, which is another point well made, any more than you can stop people eating or breathing. People giving and helping people is a universal norm. And I think what our challenge is really is to make sure it's done as effectively and as impactfully and as well as possible, rather than debating whether or not it should exist, because of course it should exist.
Karl, volunteering.
So as the director of volunteering, I have to answer this, of course, and I'm going to disappoint Beth by arguing against my own side. You are right, volunteering does absolutely fantastic things, and I spend many of my days trying to encourage it, okay? And that's because we know volunteering is a hugely powerful intervention. Robert Putnam at Harvard University says that starting volunteering is the equivalent of stopping smoking 10 cigarettes a day. Helps you find work and so on. But one of the most single urgent problems facing the voluntary sector at the moment is unequal access to volunteering, and the fact that most volunteers are white, they're well educated, okay? If volunteering is as powerful an intervention as I think it is, that strikes me that we have a serious problem if we don't do something about diversity and access to volunteering.
Hi, my name's Matt. I help companies and charities with social impact. I'm interested in drilling in a little bit more. We've talked a bit about billionaires and what they do with their investments. I was recently at a conference in San Francisco, which was very eye-opening to me, because there are a lot of billionaire foundations represented there. And it just struck me, and I think this may be part of the argument in terms of we're trying to get under the skin of the donor's intent, and what's their motive. Is it for sort of self-promotion, or is it, for PR or whatever, or are they genuinely altruistic? And so what do we know? I don't know which of the panelists would want to answer this, but what do we know about philanthropists who are taking a kind of a whole portfolio approach to their wealth? So not just about charitable giving, but restructuring their investments, divesting from all sorts of, business practices that are, climate change or gender inequality or all that kind of stuff. Is there any movement there that would suggest to us that philanthropists are getting their house in order, or is it really just a facade?
Yes, a question perhaps through Roger. Does philanthropic thinking confuse or enhance people's thinking about the development of a basic universal income?
A question for the panel. Is the problem not that philanthropy has evolved rather than been made or built as a system with various underpinning of various groups and individuals? And if it's evolved, what would be the ideal model? And what do we need to look at to make sure it works for society?
Fantastic question. Investments and divestment. Diana, anything you want to
yes,
contribute?
I think there is a minority movement, but there is a movement to definitely in favour of actually looking at what goes in as well as what comes out. There's a very famous article by an American guy who talks about philanthropy in terms of manure. We pay a lot of attention to what comes out, which is 5% of spending. That's a sort of average of what philanthropists spend on their investments. But we pay much too little attention to what goes in, so where the money comes from. And I think there is an increasing feeling amongst foundations that, or amongst leading foundations, that you need to take both into account. Believe me, if you're actually on a foundation board, that is quite an uphill struggle in many cases, because people say, oh, but we want to maximize the income for the benefit of the beneficiaries, et cetera, so no, I think there are definitely movements there, and you know the Quaker trusts actually tend to lead the way on that. So, for example, Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust has a very interesting investment policy, which is about divesting from fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera.
An evolved or built philanthropic infrastructure. Beth or Karl, would you like to comment?
Well, there's no boss of philanthropy. There's no blueprint. There's no sort of big plan. No one sitting above. And that's, you're quite right to point out that can be a problem. But actually, really, that's its beauty. That's its value. Any of us can have an idea of how we think society could be better, or a problem that needs responding to, and we can just get on and do it without having to check with the boss of philanthropy who doesn't exist. There are obviously many different visions of a good society, and sometimes they're in conflict with each other. You know, philanthropies fund both sides of many debates. You know, abortion provision, gun control, same-sex marriage. It's a space in society where we can have these arguments. So no, there is no great strategic plan, but I do think that's part of its positives rather than negative.
Is there anything that should be more planned?
I mean, it sort of strikes me, rather than sort of the argument about what, as in what causes should it support, there are arguments about how it does it. So if you look at Phil Buchanan in the US and the Center for Effective Philanthropy, some of the arguments that he's making about we need better data so that funds are going to where they're most needed and not just where they're most asked for. I think we need to think more about funding voice and advocacy and not just services. And then another thing that sort of stuck with me, a guy called David Emerson many years ago said, when you become the chief exec of a charitable foundation, this strange thing happens to you in your life, and that's nobody ever tells you the truth anymore. We need a bit more truth-telling on the part of beneficiaries to philanthropists, and things like vital signs help with that.
And universal basic income.
Well, I'm terribly ignorant about that, to be quite honest. So I don't really want to respond to make myself look more of an idiot than I've already made myself look. Other than to say that anything that we can experiment with that is actually going to lead to a redistribution of wealth and income across the globe, one would support. And indeed, it might well be something that philanthropists would like to invest in terms of various forms of experimentation. But would you mind if I just responded to the gentleman there as well, just sure. Quickly? Because as a professional sort of social researcher of 30 years, the last few years I've been trying to study very, very wealthy people. And I've come across this range of organizations called family offices. And they are involved in managing philanthropic work, of investments, but I've got a whole pile of cease and desist letters from even attempting to interview those people or to gain access to them, because the wealthy are very good at not talking to you. And I think we have a disproportionate sense of knowledge about the world, in a sense that poor people are easy to get access to. Interviewing and getting access to elites is very, very, very difficult. So I would say that we have a very warped sense of the world. I can probably name 3 or 4 studies across the world which have managed to gain real social scientific access to those places where real difficult decisions are being made that affect us all. And I think it's a real challenge to the academy to actually try and find ways of researching elites. I'm sorry, sir, about the universal income question, but I really don't feel knowledgeable enough to answer it. Is there anyone else who can say anything about it? I'm sorry, sir.
Okay, I'm going to take a last round. It probably might have to be our last round of questions, but we'll see what we can get in if you're quick.
So really, I'd be much happier if that motion read, philanthropy does more for donors than it does to change society.
But arguably some of the people that you've talked about are seeking to change society.
Hi there. You mentioned there's no boss of philanthropy and there's no blueprint, but I would argue that actually there has been over time, that it's been white, successful, industrial men that started it all, and that perhaps that's why we are where we are now, that their culture has rolled, and now we've got to the stage where it's got a critical mass and it's snowballing, and then the elites are taking over. And I would argue that on the topic of the universal wage, what about a living wage? If at the very beginning, if Joseph Rowntree had paid a living wage to his employees, if that had cottoned on then, wouldn't we have had a more equitable, fair society from beginning, and there would have been less need for charities overall, and the power would have been in the people's hands to make things like hospitals themselves, rather than leaving it in the hands of the rich white men.
My question is around the role of technology and so the panel's views on whether increasing numbers of social platforms, which perhaps enable more people to give, not so much just the exclusive, very, very wealthy, whether those ultimately will be a good thing, or whether there are concerns about what that then might mean in terms of transparency and accountabilities. We perhaps see the disappearance of some of the intermediary agencies. So I think that's my question.
So would it make a difference if the debate motion was, philanthropy does more for donors than it does for social change? Was that the yes? Or would that just make you even more entrenched in your perspective?
I mean, I understand why you make that point, Terence, and I have a lot of sympathy with it. But I think the point that I keep coming back to is it's not whether you approve of what philanthropists do or philanthropy does. It's whether there is any democratic debate around that. To me, it comes down to, if you have lots of money, should you have that additional influence on society? A few years ago, we all got very hot under the collar because people were buying votes, cash for votes in Parliament. Well, when Bill Gates puts his money behind charter schools in the States, Bill Gates is known in the States in some circles as the real Minister of State for Education. So it's not whether I agree with Aaron Banks or whoever, it's whether I have any control over that. Beth said anybody can have an idea. Yes, anybody can have an idea, but ideas with lots of money behind them tend to get rather more traction than ones that don't.
Okay, any other points to pick up on this side? Technology, social change?
Your point about a boss of philanthropy, well, the closest thing that we've had to a boss of philanthropy in this country is someone called Dame Stephanie Shirley, who for a couple of years was Gordon Brown's ambassador for philanthropy. But interestingly, you might know that she's widely known not as Stephanie Shirley, but as Steve Shirley, because she had to put up with so much sexism in the IT industry that she changed her name to a man's name. But she's a good example of a modern, brilliant philanthropist. On your point about technology, I think you're right. I think it's deeply worrying. It's not that intermediaries are disappearing, it's that they're being replaced by a different set of intermediaries. And my concern is that philanthropy is turning into a popularity contest.
And just to back up what Karl said, one of the interesting things I've seen in the decade that I've been studying major donors is a shift towards people saying, rather than interviewing somebody by themselves, the white man with the money, people saying, actually, can we be interviewed as a couple or as a family? Because that was always a reality, that the wives and the children and the people who had a vested interest in the money were also part of the decision-making. So perhaps that goes partly to Roger's question about, are we doing a slightly better social science by making sure we do interview other people? So the Why Rich People Give study that I've done with Theresa Lloyd has shifted more into studying couples and families. So I think that's definitely, so thank you for that question to give me a chance to clarify that.
Well, you know, like 10, 15 years ago, people talked about the World Wide Web and you didn't really know what it was. Well, at the moment, the thing that is going to change all of our lives is a technology called blockchain technologies. And blockchain technologies are funded by Peter Thiel and people like Peter Thiel for a reason. And it will change many, many things, including philanthropic giving, peer-to-peer finance, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and a whole world that sounds very, very technical, but it's going to change fundamentally how money circulates. And that's where lots of the money that we've been talking about tonight comes from at the moment. Blockchain technology, you heard it here first.
So the debating is over, and the time has come to see who's won. Perhaps nobody's won. Perhaps there will be a majority abstaining. So the motion is on the screen. Philanthropy does more for donors than it does for society. So I'm going to ask you by a show of hands that all of you who agree with the motion, that is, you think philanthropy does do more for donors than it does for society. So can I see all those in favour of the motion by a show of hands? Okay. I'm not going to count. Okay. By a show of hands, then, can I also see all those who are against the motion, i.e. you think philanthropy does more for society than it does for donors? I've got a job still. And all those, importantly, who are still undecided or who wish to abstain. Actually, I think that's slightly more than the people who were in favour of the motion.
You need another GeNErosity festival to help to them next year.
Great. So, thank you so much for participating in that. I think I can declare that the motion has been lost and that on a democratic vote, the audience believes that philanthropy does do more for society than it does for donors. Thank you very much. So, all that remains for me to do is to thank our brilliant panel, who each have all given generously of their time and their expertise this evening. So, thanks to Roger Burrows, to Diana Leat, to Karl Wilding, and to Beth Breeze. And thank you again to Northumberland University for hosting us this evening. Thank you to you all for your fantastic contributions. Thank you again to our panel, and good night. Thank you very much.